Well, thank you for having me. I started coming to Abu Dhabi 32 years ago, and I've been very lucky to see the evolution and understand the culture. So I'm very grateful to Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, and all my friends here. So thank you for having me. I've been given the assignment of describing how the world order is changing and what to do about it. And I'm supposed to do that in about 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to talk fast. I approach this subject as a global macro investor who has, for the last 30 years, bet on global markets. And over those 30 years, I found that when I was surprised, it was typically because of events that happened in my lifetime. Let me say that again. It was because events that happened to me didn't happen in my lifetime, but they happened many times before. And that led me to study history, to develop my decision-making rules, and place my bets on the basis of those. With that perspective, I was able to anticipate big developments in the world that I otherwise would have missed. For example, by studying the Great Depression, I was able to participate or anticipate the 2008 financial crisis and make a lot of money for myself and my clients, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I didn't study the 30s. About 5 years ago, I saw three big developments that I hadn't seen in my lifetime and that I knew happened in the 1930 to 1945 period. They were, first, big increases in indebtedness financed by big debt monetizations. Second, big irreconcilable wealth and values differences within countries that led to populism of the right and populism of the left, and big conflicts between those. And third, a powerful rising power, now China, challenging the existing leading power, now the United States, and challenging its world order. These things have happened repeatedly through history. So that led me to study the rises and declines of great powers and their markets over the last 500 years, which showed me how these things happened repeatedly over time. I converted that study into a book because I thought it was worthwhile, and to pass that along. Copies of the book are available for you if you want to get them when you're going out. But I'm going to show you a clip of a 40-minute video. The way to communicate effectively nowadays is not necessarily through books, but I found it effective through videos. And there's a 4-minute clip that I'm going to show you from the 40-minute video, which is also available on YouTube if you want to see it. So here it is.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
That's a summary that I call the big cycle that is repeated throughout history. They're never exactly the same, but you get the drift. In brief, I learned that while there are many factors that change the world order, there are 5 big forces that drive just about everything. They are the money debt force. In other words, spending power comes from credit more than anything. Credit produces debt, which has to be paid back. So there's a debt money economic market cycle that we're acquainted with. There's also an internal political disorder cycle due to wealth and values gaps that we're seeing become manifest in most of the countries right now. Uncompromisable differences causing political turbulence and threats to democracy as we know them. Then there's an external geopolitical order that I touched on, which is the great powers conflict. And then there's also acts of nature. Droughts, floods, pandemics have killed more people than wars, and it's certainly a big issue. And economically as well. It's going to cost about $8 trillion a year, roughly. That's 8% of world GDP. And number 5 is human inventiveness, particularly of new technologies. So if you look at those 5 forces has always existed, and everything that we're going to talk about really is a function of those 5 forces and how they're operating. The first chart that I'm going to show you shows U.S. government debt and debt service going back to 1900. I want to put these big things in perspective. So the first chart shows debt and debt service going back to 1900, and it shows the projections going forward. And the one to the right shows the total amount of debt. So that amount of level of indebtedness will not be sustainable. So we're going to have a debt issue. One man's debts are another man's assets. And so to be able to be paid back in a real return is going to be expensive for debtors to deal with. This is not just a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. The next chart shows the big debt cycle going back to 1865 in China. You could see the rise, then the repudiation of debt during that period of time, and the rise again. And it shouldn't be obvious, and I think everybody knows that there's a big debt issue in China. And the next chart, series of charts, shows this for most of the countries around the world. So it shows many countries' debts. I won't get into all of them, but they're all projected to rise. This is an important factor. As shown in these charts, all major countries except Germany have increased and are projected to increase their debts at unprecedented levels. Based on the calculations that I've done, I believe that it is impossible for these countries to be able to not have a debt crisis in the years ahead, and that will lead to a great decline of value of money and as we know it. One man's debts are another man's assets, and when you own a debt asset, you own money, and the ability to print money is what the way of dealing with this is all about. And I believe that what we're seeing is this incipient dynamic is behind and will continue to be behind the rises of gold and cryptocurrencies that we're now seeing. These next charts that I'm going to show are going to be about wealth and values gaps. The chart to the left is about the wealth gaps, and what they show back to 1900 is that we have now in the United States and a number of countries the largest wealth gaps since the 1930 to 45 period. The one on the right shows the ideological differences. The blue line shows measures of how far left the Democratic Party has become, and the one on the right, the red chart, shows how far right the Republican Party has come. And there's also a chart that shows voting across party lines, and it just reflects the conflict that we're seeing. So as you can see, they're the largest reported in our lifetimes. So we have these political and economic differences in each countries that are the largest since the 1930s. The next two charts show the great power conflict between the two greatest powers of today, the United States and Germany, the United States and China. I bring them back to 1850. The reason I'm putting these charts out to show the long term is because I think we can get trapped in seeing just the short term, and we miss some of these big things. The first chart is a total power index of the United States and China going back to 1850. In it, I combine measures of economic, geopolitical, military power into one index. Those are the indexes that I mentioned earlier. And it shows what we know, which is that there has been a great rise in China's power relative to the United States' power, so that China's total power is approaching that of the United States. The chart on the right is a conflict gauge that is made up of several measures of conflict. It shows what we also know, which is that the conflicts between the United States and China and their allies are intensifying to be the most significant since the 1935 to 40 period. So to me, it appears obvious that we're in a period of increasing conflict. It's taking place both between and within most countries: the United States, China, France, the UK, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, And many other countries are going through this internal conflict at the same time as there's this external conflict. And so there's also all of those countries facing an impending debt problem. And that all makes for a dangerous situation. History also shows that during periods of great conflict, well-run neutral countries do exceptionally well, while those in conflict, even the winners, lose. The winners still get themselves in debt and still have the damages of the war. The neutral countries work. So a principle to keep in mind at such times is to consider spending time in the neutral countries where there is little conflict and within the country and little conflict with foreign countries. As for climate change, there should be no doubt that it is intensifying and that it's going to be very costly. This chart shows both the CO2 levels and also temperature levels. So in limited time, I can't spend much time on it, but as I said, it's estimated that is going to have a very big economic impact as well as social impact. As for technology changes, there have always been, and there are now more than ever, great technology changes that increase productivity and raise living standards. The next two charts show the effects of these changes on per capita GDP and life expectancy. Again, this long-term pattern is worth paying attention. This goes down to 1,500, but you can see our real GDP per capita accelerates, and a good measure of that is in life expectancy, which is the chart on the right. So to show technology changes and their impacts, I created also an innovation index, which is based on patents, discoveries, and stock prices, which is intended to capture the amounts of expected values and new and expected technology changes. Based on it and what I know, I believe that we are headed for the most impactful technology changes ever because of the enormous advances in artificial intelligence. I expect that these advances will produce huge changes in all dimensions of our lives that are unimaginable today, some great and some terrible. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with choices, such as where do we want to be and what do we want to invest in? As for where we want to be during this turbulent time, there's a Chinese expression that says, a smart rabbit has 3 holes. In other words, 3 places to go for safety. While that we're seeing these places, in many cases, deteriorating, we are also seeing other places that have never been better, and deal-making has never been more global. I mean, look at us here today and how we've been moving from places that are the good places and to do deal-making. There's essentially a circuit of financial deal makers, often coming to with their Formula One teams who travel to it, and increasingly smart, productive people are also establishing offices and residence in these good places, which are the places that are friendly, financially sound, and have internal order rather than internal conflict, and have less rather than more risk of being in an international war. In addition to the previously mentioned qualities, places that have a diverse population of smart, nice people with vibrancy, where families can live well and their children can be well educated. I believe that the GCC and Singapore are the best examples of those. That is why I'm here, and I'm excited to be about these places becoming regional centers of smart family office investing. They are renaissance state in a world of turbulence, I believe. As for the assets to invest in, because I believe that there will likely be a pending debt money problem, I want to steer away from debt assets like bonds and cash and have some hard money like gold and Bitcoin. And because I believe that we're having a technology disruption because of AI, I want to invest in those companies that are using it to dramatically improve their business rather than the superscalers. And I'm active in a number of other markets. As I've run out of my 15 minutes, I will rush through just a couple of more suggestions. First, don't get too caught up on the twists and turns of the day-to-day headlines, and instead think more about the big forces that are transpiring. So think strategically as well as tactically, taking a global perspective while recognizing that what you don't know about the future is more than what you do know. So make sure you have diversification and optionality built into your strategy. If you keep that in mind, I think you'll be able to recognize the threats and see the opportunities, and you will be well positioned to deal with them well. So thank you for your 15 minutes, or maybe I've gone a little over. I apologize. Thank you very much.